This story happened around 2 years ago. We had been entering an abandoned flour mill and factory for about 3 years. This is when we were 14 or 15. My mates and I began going through the second floor window, and at the time, it was winter, meaning everything was freezing and completely icy. We went in the window to avoid being seen by security cameras. One night, when we were in there, we were just sitting down in room 5, fooling around, which I don't advise. When we were there, in the little hallway to the room, there were 3 consecutive loud bangs. At this point, we were on the second floor, and there was no way someone could reach the windows without some way to climb up. When we realized it was inside, we all shot down to the floor to stay hidden. A man began screaming, almost in rhythm. He was saying, "I know you're in here." We were scared, and after 10 minutes, which felt like 10 hours, we started thinking that we needed to get out. We saw a flashlight in the opposite room. Realizing he couldn't see us without the light, we started sneaking over towards the door to get out. It was at that moment that another voice shouted, "Have you found them yet?" The man replied, "No." We then realized that the only way we could get out would be to jump out the window onto one of the old sheds in the yard. We turned around and started heading to the window. Now you're probably thinking, why didn't you go that way first? That's because there's a good 2-meter gap to the shed from the building, and it could collapse on us when we land on it. We tried to open the window, but it was stuck. My friend Nat said sorry, then he put his arm through the window. At that moment, the man had seen us, and we got lit up. We all turned around and saw a clown. We were terrified, and got out of that window in no time. Nat and I landed on top of the shed. My other mate Cal was about to jump, but the clown grabbed him. He physically got hold and wouldn't let go. Cal headbutted him and kicked him, struggling to get out the window just in time. We got down from the shed and bolted out of the yard. As we were running, we saw not 2, but 3 lights, all in separate windows. We were all running towards the exit outside of the yard. It was terrifying, but we ran out of that yard. There was a little gate, which we climbed up to get to the window that we usually used. Me and Cal wasted no time in slamming into that gate, and then another clown popped out of the window and began laughing at us as we ran out of the building. We don't go back to that place at night anymore, or without at least 6 of us together. A little backstory about myself. I'm a 29-year-old Colombian female. Being born and raised in Colombia, I had my share of dangerous and scary experiences. The first one I can think of is this one. The story that my mom told me once I was old enough to cope with it. She's a fairly religious woman. We all are, after all. We're Catholic to the core. She was born in this tiny rural town, deep in the Colombian plains. This deserted part of the country is famous for cattle raising, coke plants, harvesting, and guerrilla encounters with the military and paramilitary groups. Needless to say, it's a rough place to grow up, especially for a small female like my mom was. They were a rather poor family. My grandfather worked as a Jeep driver instead of cabs since there were no concrete roads. He worked from dusk until dawn, but not nearly making as much as he needed to support his rather large family. My grandmother took care of the kids, 5 in total, 2 girls and 3 boys. She made ice cream and other stuff to sell around the town. My mom grew up pretty much on her own. My grandmother was a very moody woman and did not show emotion or love towards anyone, ever. They used to go to church every Sunday, for this is pretty much the only thing you do around these places. One day, my mom was being a little difficult. She was only 6, but she remembers going to church and then making a scene at the end, because she did not get a treat at the town plaza. My grandmother, being the short-fused woman that she was, told her to stop it, or else she would be taken by the devil for being a bad girl. This was a very common threat back then, in such a religious society. She neither stopped, nor gave any mind to what her mother was saying. Then she saw him. He was a rather tall man, dressed really well. He was staring at them from the other side of the plaza. People were walking in front of him hastily, as others walked around. No one seemed to notice him. My mom stopped crying and the man just smiled and waved, slowly and candidly. My mom just stared and waved back. She was 6 years old after all. She didn't know what else to do. My grandmother was just glad she had finally shut up, so she took her home, almost dragging her down the road. That night, when they had all gone to bed, my mom woke up to the sound of a tiny chick. She loved animals, and she was very used to them. Living in such a rural town as she did, it was common to see them around. She thought maybe she could catch it and keep it, so she woke up, put on her flip-flops, and slowly started to chase the sound of the tiny chick, not seeing it, but hearing it all the time. She slowly started walking towards the back of the house. In Colombia, people are very poor, and houses usually don't have walls at the back, so you can literally just walk right out. That's what she did. It was pitch black, but she knew how to handle herself in the dark. Also, she was a pretty fierce little girl, always playing rough with the boys and scratching her knees. She walked out of the backyard. She passed the giant mango tree that was the limit of her house. The chick sounded so near, she just had to catch it. She did not see the chick though, but just kept walking in the dark, trying to reach it. Sometimes it sounded really close, like right next to her, but sometimes it kind of faded out, as if the chick was a mile away. This kept on for a while, until she found herself in a place she hadn't seen before. She knew her town, and she knew she was lost. She stood in the middle of a tiny hill, glancing around. She thought that maybe she could see her house from there, but she didn't. Then she heard it again. The chick was so far away. The sound was almost unintelligible, and then a voice.
"Glad to see you again, little Pat. We've been waiting for you."
She turned around to see the same man from the plaza. His eyes glared in the moonlight. The same warm smile, and black hat, black coat, black vest, and black pants. Next to him, there was a lady she knew well, Mrs. Lopez, from the crooked street next to the military base. She looked pretty much as always, just sitting there in her Sunday dress, black as the night itself. She also had a black lace veil on the back of her hair. Her hands were crossed on her lap. They were both sitting on a fallen log, a huge log that was kind of decomposing. My mom saw worms crawling out and insects moving all around it. She then realized the smell. It stunk of rotten meat, rotten eggs, and bad breath, all at the same time. She felt like throwing up. She gasped and covered her mouth with her hands. It was then that she tried to scream. The scream did not come out, but the man started laughing. It was a surprisingly warm laugh, kind of like leaves crunching under your feet. It wasn't menacing, so she took her hands off her mouth. He then looked at her candidly and said,
"Your mom told me to come for you. Don't be afraid. We're gonna have a great time."
He then stood up, and that's when horror hit her. Then Mrs. Lopez stood up and opened her mouth. She heard the chick again. This time it was very far away, but coming from her mouth for sure. She took off running, the way she thought she had come from, screaming bloody murder and crying. She never looked back, but she kept hearing the chick, sometimes far, sometimes close, sometimes so close it made her run even faster. She then saw a light flickering through the field. The scarce trees let her see through, and she recognized the shape of my grandfather's broad shoulders. His flashlight moved around in front of her. She screamed at him, and stood up looking around until she finally reached and hugged him. My grandfather just stood there, holding his little girl, until she stopped crying. Then she told him about the man and Mrs. Lopez. He brushed it off, saying she had a nightmare and not to worry. She insisted it was real, but she was instead harshly disciplined for sneaking out in the middle of the night. Dawn came, and my grandmother sat at the kitchen table and called her up. She knew she was in for it, so she was preparing for the worst. But surprisingly, her mother didn't have a belt or anything in her hands. She was just sitting there, looking concerned, and asked her to sit. My mom complied, and then she asked what happened last night. My mom told her everything, from the moment she heard the chick until she saw my grandfather. My grandmother just listened wide-eyed, twisting her fingers and cracking her knuckles. When my mom stopped, she told her what happened. She apologized for calling her a bad girl and threatening to give her away to the devil. She then started crying and saying she didn't know any better. She had been raised that way as well, and that's the only way she knew how to deal with her children. My mom was confused. Why was she apologizing? She then promised her nothing would happen to her, but she needed to behave better and never ever leave the house without her knowing again. When I was growing up, my neighborhood was seen as very safe. That is until this incident. I'm from a small town in the Midwest of the United States. There was a single grocery store, a post office, and a school, etc. There was also a bus station. The train station was in the next town over, about a 45-minute drive. My dad ran a landscaping company, making him one of the few people in our town who was not involved in agriculture. Our house was a large 2-story place on the corner lot of one of the main residential streets. I had 2 younger brothers and an older sister, and there was still plenty of space for the whole family. That being said, we were still around average income for the area. It was a nice town, where everyone pretty much had everything they needed. Therefore, there was not much reason for crime in the area. Recently, however, there were several break-ins reported in the community. None of our direct neighbors, but it was still pretty creepy. The weird thing, though, is that nothing was ever really taken. Nothing valuable anyway. Some people reported having various clothing items taken. Really, that makes it more creepy than if it was simply for money. I was in the 11th grade at the only high school in town. My best friends were Casey and James, and one day, we were sitting in the cafeteria at lunchtime. James was telling us about one of the break-ins. One of them happened only 2 houses down from him, and he told us that he saw a broken window with blood dripping down the glass while the police were there. We all thought he was exaggerating, but we were still kind of scared. No one had any idea who was behind it all. It was like a dark cloud looming over our community. On Friday night, I was hanging out at Casey's place with James and a few other friends. We were in his backyard around the fire pit, just telling some scary stories and stuff. Eventually, we started to speculate on who could be behind the break-ins. I thought it was some high school kids. There were a few cliques of troublemakers in our school, and I thought they fit the bill. Casey thought it was some outsider who came into our town and was hiding out somewhere. That didn't make any sense to me, because there was really nowhere for a creep to stay in town without being noticed. It also seemed like a lot of effort to break into a few houses and not really take anything. We were at a loss. None of us could explain it. At around midnight, everyone started to leave. Casey lived about 2 or 3 miles out of the main area of our town, where my house was. I rode my bike though, so it only took me around 20 minutes to get home. As I was riding, there were fields on either side, with houses sparsely dotted between. On my way, I noticed something strange. There was a pickup truck parked in the road ahead of me. As I passed it, I looked in, but it was empty. I don't know who it belonged to, because everyone had a similar truck. There was a house nearby, belonging to Mrs. Foster, one of the teachers at my school. She would have no reason to park on the road, though, because there was plenty of space around her house. I was curious, so I turned off the front and back lights of my bike and crouched down about 100 feet in front of the truck. It was a dark night, and I was sure that I was hidden from sight. I sat there for about 15 minutes, and then the truck's lights came to life. The bright glow lit up a man who was approaching the vehicle. I recognized him. It was a man named Victor. He lived only a few houses down from me. He had a family with 2 daughters. Both of them went to my school. As the truck began to move, I realized that he was going to see me. It was a stupid mistake for me to hide in front of him instead of behind. I still didn't know what he was doing there. Obviously, I thought he might be the burglar, but I didn't know for sure. I got back on my bike and started pedaling. As the truck came up beside me and passed, I felt relieved. That would be short-lived though, because it pulled in front of me and blocked the entire road. He trapped me. If I turned around, then he could do the same thing in the other direction. In an instant, I made the decision to turn off the road into the field. It was a mostly empty field at that time of year, so I was able to move easily. It was almost pitch dark though, so I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I couldn't turn on my light, otherwise I'd be seen. As I made my way through the field, I could see the truck's bright lights. I used them to guide me. I just needed to get past that truck, and then I could get away. I quietly slipped back onto the road. He didn't see me. When I got home, I woke up my parents and told them what happened to me. To my relief, they believed every word. We called the police right then and there. After we reported the incident, I was kicking myself for not taking a picture of the truck and its license plate. I was disappointed that Victor was never arrested. Mrs. Foster never reported a break-in, so there was not much to go on. One thing I can say, though, is that after this incident, no more break-ins were ever reported. I think Victor was behind it, but I was never able to prove it. I think he got spooked by what happened that night. It was a really awkward situation in our town after that. Some people believed me, and others didn't. I moved away soon after, and I only go back on rare occasions. I used to live in a large apartment complex in a small town. I almost never saw the police around there. They were never needed. The story's about the time when all that changed. I say it was a large complex, but it was only large compared to anything else in the area. There were just 3 5-story buildings. It was right near the lake, and there were many houses in the surrounding area as well. It was a really nice spot, so even though it was a small town, there were a lot of people in that specific area. Some of the houses were really fancy, probably multi-million-dollar homes. Compare that to the tiny bachelor apartment that I lived in at the time. There was also one house right on the water that was converted into a retirement home. Not a bad place to be in long-term care. I would sometimes see the old ladies going for walks in the area and by the water. We would stop and chat sometimes, but sometimes they just kept to themselves. The lake was to the south, and in all other directions, there were houses. If you went further away from the lake, then you would get to the main street of our town, where we had some businesses and restaurants. The people from the retirement home usually wouldn't walk that far. It was nicer by the lake anyway. Like I said, it was such a safe place that the police didn't come by often. That's why I was so surprised one day to see the road by the lake was packed with more police cars than I'd ever seen in my life. There were at least 10 of them parked on the road surrounding my apartment building. Not only that, but there were more of them patrolling the area. I was too scared to ask what was going on. I guess I thought I would look like a suspect or something if I did. I was heading back to my apartment when an officer approached me. He explained that a woman had gone missing from the old age home. He showed me a picture of her and asked if I had seen her. I didn't recognize the woman at all, and I had never seen her in the area. I figured she must have been new to the home, because I would recognize most of them. I parted ways with the officer and went home, hoping they would find the missing person. In the coming days, the police presence decreased. I kept seeing posters for the missing woman, though. They were all over the place. Every day there would be a few police cars in the area, looking for the woman I assumed. The really disturbing part was that if she had wandered into one of the yards of the houses, or into town, there's no doubt she would have been found quickly. The old age home being on the lake, there's really only one place a missing person could hide for that amount of time. About 2 weeks later, I heard on the news that a body had washed ashore from the lake about 10 miles away. I never looked at the lake the same way again.